Calcutta, January 1858. The morning mist rises from the Hooghly River like breath from a sleeping giant, curling through the marble colonnades of Writers' Building, where 23 British clerks sit hunched over ledgers, their pens scratching orders that will ripple across the subcontinent. The air smells of coal smoke and sandalwood, ink and monsoon rot. Beyond these walls, 400 million souls move through their morning rituals, lighting clay lamps before household gods, drawing water from ancient wells, bargaining in bazaars that existed before Rome fell, unaware that their fates are being decided by men they will never see, whose language they will never speak, whose faces remain as distant and unknowable as the portraits of kings hung in government halls. A clerk dips his nib, signs a requisition for grain shipments from Punjab to Madras, and with that single stroke, 10,000 farmers in the Sutlej Valley will plant wheat instead of millet next season. They will not know why. They will never know who decided. This is the machinery of empire at its most insidious perfection, invisible, impersonal, absolute. The British Empire in India was not held by the sword alone, though swords there were in abundance. It was not maintained merely through superior technology, though the rifles and railways certainly helped. The true genius of British control lay in something far more sophisticated, far more chilling in its elegance. The construction of an administrative system so vast, so intricate, so deeply embedded in the sinews of daily life that it became indistinguishable from reality itself. By the latter half of the 19th century, fewer than 100 British civil servants of the Indian Civil Service's covenanted ranks, the elite corps known simply as the Heaven-born, wielded direct administrative power over territories larger than Europe, populations exceeding the entire Western Hemisphere combined. They did not rule through constant presence or brutal oversight. They ruled through paperwork, through precedent, through the systematic transformation of human existence into data points in leather-bound registers. They ruled through making themselves the sole interpreters of a legal and bureaucratic language that turned ancient rights into colonial permissions, communal lands into government property, traditional authority into quaint custom requiring official sanction. The mathematics of this control should have been impossible. In 1858, when the British Crown formally assumed governance from the East India Company after the great upheaval that the British called the Mutiny, and Indians remembered as the First War of Independence, there were approximately 900 British civil servants governing British India proper, not including the princely states that covered 2/5 of the subcontinent. Of these 900, only the covenanted members of the Indian Civil Service, never more than 120 at any given moment in the critical decades of the mid-19th century, held real decision-making power over revenue collection, judicial authority, and administrative policy. Below them were thousands of Indian subordinates, clerks and translators and minor officials, but these men wielded only the authority delegated from above, operating within frameworks they had no power to alter. One British district collector might oversee a territory of 5,000 square miles containing 2 million inhabitants. He would see perhaps a dozen villages personally in a given year. Yet his decisions governed every aspect of life: which crops could be taxed at what rates, which disputes qualified for judicial hearing, which roads would be built or neglected, which traditional water rights would be recognized or dissolved into state control. The mechanism of this impossible governance began not in India, but in London, in the India Office on Whitehall, where policy was drafted by men who had never felt the blast furnace heat of an Indian summer or smelled the peculiar sweetness of a Bengali rice harvest. It flowed through the Viceroy's Council in Calcutta or Simla, then down through provincial governors, commissioners, and finally to the district collector, the man on the spot, the king of his domain, typically a young Englishman, barely 30 years old, who found himself the final arbiter of justice, taxation, and development for populations exceeding that of many European nations. These young men arrived fresh from Oxford or Cambridge, their heads stuffed with classics and cricket, utterly ignorant of any Indian language beyond the Hindustani they learned from grammar books during the sea voyage out. Yet within months of landing, they would be expected to adjudicate property disputes rooted in family feuds, generations old, to assess the productive capacity of agricultural land whose cultivation techniques had evolved over millennia. To navigate the intricate hierarchies of caste and custom that governed every social interaction in villages whose names they could barely pronounce. That they succeeded at all, that this ludicrous system functioned with enough efficiency to extract wealth, maintain order, and perpetuate itself for nearly a century, stands as one of history's most unsettling achievements. It succeeded not despite its absurdity, but through it, through the systematic exploitation of information asymmetry and the colonization of knowledge itself. The British did not need to understand India to rule it. They needed only to create systems that made India legible to British understanding, to transform the chaotic, organic, infinitely complex reality of the subcontinent into forms, statistics, maps, and reports that could be processed by administrators who viewed the entire enterprise as essentially similar to managing a large estate or reforming a parish. Villages that had governed their own affairs through councils of elders for centuries found themselves answering to a manual of administrative procedure written in English. Farmers whose great-grandfathers had worked the same land under arrangements sanctified by custom and community memory were told their rights derived not from tradition, but from entries in a settlement register compiled by a British surveyor who had spent 3 weeks in their district. Consider the settlement officer, a position that barely existed before British rule, but became the foundation of their entire revenue system. Armed with theodolites and measuring chains, with standardized forms and thick manuals of procedure, settlement officers traversed districts recording every field, every well, every tree of consequence. They interviewed farmers and landlords through interpreters, reducing centuries of agrarian practice into neat categories: owner, tenant, subtenant, laborer. They measured productivity in terms that made sense to political economy, but often bore little relationship to how farming actually worked. Ignoring the complex reciprocal obligations that bound communities together, the ways families shared labor across holdings, the survival strategies that involved multiple crops, animal husbandry, craft production, and gathering rights in forests that might lie miles from their primary fields. The settlement officer's report became reality. If the report said a man was a tenant with no ownership rights, then he was a tenant, regardless of whether his family had worked that land as their own for 10 generations. If the report classified certain forest land as waste, suitable for government timber operations, then the villagers who had gathered firewood and medicinal plants there for centuries became trespassers on their own ancestral commons. This was violence committed through paperwork, oppression executed through the neutral language of administration. And the terrible genius of it was that the violence remained invisible to both perpetrator and victim, dispersed through a system so vast that no single person could grasp its totality. The British settlement officer genuinely believed he was bringing order to chaos, establishing clear property rights where previously only fuzzy custom existed, modernizing a backward land through the application of rational administrative procedure. He could not see, the system was designed so he would not see, that he was destroying sustainable subsistence patterns, concentrating land ownership in the hands of those wealthy enough to navigate the new legal system, and turning farmers into debtors who must now produce cash crops for export rather than food for their families, all to generate the revenue that would pay for the very administrative apparatus that oppressed them. And the farmer, watching his traditional rights evaporate, often had no clear understanding of what had happened. He knew only that he must now pay rent to a landlord whose claim derived from a piece of paper he could not read, that he must now seek permission from a distant official to use land his family had always used, that debt had become inescapable and hunger more frequent. But the connection between his suffering and the young Englishman in the district headquarters remained obscure, mediated through layers of Indian subordinates, moneylenders, and intermediaries. The railway tracks that began to spine across India from the 1850s onward served as the perfect symbol of this new order. The locomotives themselves were impressive, modern, powerful, visible signs of British technological superiority and the benefits of progressive development. But follow those tracks to their origin and purpose, and you find something else entirely. The railways were built not primarily to benefit Indian commerce or mobility, but to serve 3 British imperatives: moving troops rapidly to suppress rebellion, transporting raw materials from interior regions to coastal ports for export and creating profitable investment opportunities for British capital. The routes were planned in London and Calcutta, not in response to where Indians actually needed to travel, but according to strategic and commercial calculations that had nothing to do with local development. Villages that had been centers of regional trade for centuries found themselves bypassed, withering away while new railway towns, often little more than administrative stations and military cantonments, grew up at arbitrary points along the line. Farmers in grain surplus regions discovered that their local prices now fluctuated according to demand in Bombay or Calcutta, hundreds of miles away, making subsistence more precarious as merchants found it profitable to export grain even during local shortages. The railway was progress certainly, but progress defined by and directed toward British interests, progress that restructured economic geography to serve extraction rather than development. And yet the locomotives ran on Indian coal, mined by Indian labor, on tracks laid by Indian hands, following schedules maintained by Indian station masters and guards. The empire could not function without massive Indian participation in its own subordination. This was perhaps the cruelest achievement of all, the creation of an indigenous administrative class whose identity and interest became tied to the continuation of British rule. The Indian Civil Service examinations, opened to Indian candidates in 1853 after years of pressure from Indian reformers who believed in the liberal promises of British rhetoric, were held in London in English, covering subjects centered entirely on European history, literature, and thought. The handful of Indians who managed to succeed, traveling to Britain at great expense, studying texts utterly foreign to their own cultural traditions, competing in a language they had learned in missionary schools, found themselves rewarded with positions of relative prestige and comfort, but always subordinate to British colleagues, always operating within frameworks they had no power to change. They became the translators of British will, explaining to their countrymen why the new land assessment was fair, why the forest must now be closed to villagers, why the traditional tax exemption for religious institutions could no longer be honored. They lent Indian faces to British policy, diffusing resentment by making the immediate source of orders appear Indian rather than foreign. Below these elite Indian civil servants operated an army of subordinate officials, clerks, and minor functionaries, perhaps 50,000 strong by the late 19th century, who formed the actual interface between British administration and the Indian population. These were the men who sat in tehsil offices recording deeds, who accompanied the district collector on tour to translate and take notes, who served as lower court judges and revenue inspectors and police officers. They were poorly paid, insecure in their positions, subject to arbitrary discipline from British superiors who rarely spoke their language or understood their challenges. Corruption became endemic, not because Indians were inherently dishonest, but because the system created incentives and pressures that made corruption almost inevitable. A village accountant might earn 15 rupees per month, but be expected to maintain detailed records for dozens of villages, traveling constantly, purchasing his own supplies. When a farmer with a property dispute offered him a few rupees to make sure the records reflected his version of events, or when a merchant paid to have his tax assessment recorded at a lower figure, the accountant faced a choice between supplementing his inadequate salary or starving. British administrators routinely condemned Indian subordinates for the very corruption the system itself generated, using it as evidence of native moral inadequacy rather than examining how their own administrative structures created these dynamics. The legal system the British constructed operated on similar principles of mystification and control. Before British rule, justice in most of India was swift, local, and comprehensible. Village councils adjudicated most disputes through mediation, seeking to preserve community harmony rather than determining absolute right and wrong. Religious authorities handled matters of personal law and inheritance according to well-understood traditions. More serious criminal matters might go to a local ruler's court, but even these operated with relative informality and accessibility. The British swept this away, constructing an elaborate edifice of courts following English common law procedures, with professional judges, formal rules of evidence, written pleadings, and endless opportunities for appeal. Cases that would have been settled in days now dragged on for years. Justice became something purchased. Lawyers charged fees. Court clerks required payments to file documents. Witnesses had to be brought from distant villages at considerable expense. The law was written in English and Persian, interpreted by judges who might have no knowledge of local custom or religious tradition. Legal precedent from London became binding on Indian judges dealing with Indian disputes. The result was a system whose very complexity served as an instrument of control, making the pursuit of justice so expensive and time-consuming that most Indians simply gave up, accepting unfavorable settlements rather than entering the labyrinth of British courts. Yet this same legal system was held up as one of the great benefits of British rule, proof that empire brought civilization and the rule of law to a land of arbitrary despotism. British administrators genuinely believed this. They read the elaborate codes and careful judgments and saw order, rationality, impartiality. They could not see, or refused to see, that they had replaced accessible justice with a system accessible only to those with resources and education, that they had transformed law from a tool of community cohesion into a weapon of economic warfare, where the wealthy could use litigation to seize the property of those unable to afford adequate legal representation. When Indian nationalists later charged that British law served British interests, they were not speaking in abstractions. The law protected British commercial advantages, recognized British property claims, enforced contracts written in British favor. It criminalized traditional practices that conflicted with colonial economic policy. Hunting in forests now declared state property, cutting trees now classified as government timber. Even gathering fallen wood for fuel could become criminal trespass. It provided no protection against the economic violence of famine, the theft of wages by employers, the exploitation of indentured laborers shipped to British colonies overseas. The rule of law meant the rule of British law, serving British purposes. The educational system completed this architecture of control by colonizing the minds of those who might otherwise have resisted. Macaulay's infamous 1835 Minute on Education stated the goal explicitly: to create a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect, who would serve as intermediaries between the British and the millions they governed. The traditional Indian education systems, the village schools where children learned to read and calculate in their own languages, the madrasas and pathshalas where religious and cultural knowledge was transmitted, the system of apprenticeship through which craft knowledge passed from master to student. These received no government support and were often actively discouraged. Instead, the British established schools and eventually universities where instruction was in English, curricula centered on European literature and history, and the entire structure of thought was modeled on British institutions. An Indian student might study Shakespeare and Milton in depth while learning nothing of Kalidasa or Tulsidas, might memorize the battles of the War of the Roses while remaining ignorant of the Mauryan Empire, might learn to write elegant English essays while unable to read the classical literature of his own tradition. This was not accidental. The British understood that cultural colonization was deeper and more permanent than political control. A generation educated to believe that all true knowledge, all genuine civilization, all worthy achievement was European, would naturally accept European rule as legitimate. They would police themselves, internalizing the values and hierarchies of empire without needing to be constantly supervised. And it worked to a disturbing degree. The English-educated Indian middle class that emerged from these institutions in the late 19th century often viewed their own traditions with contempt, seeing them through the lens of colonial anthropology and Orientalist scholarship as superstitious, backward, irrational. They sought to reform Hindu society to bring it closer to British Victorian ideals, campaigned against practices the British found objectionable, and measured progress in terms of how closely Indian society could approximate European models. The most tragic element of this cultural imperialism was that its victims often embraced it eagerly, seeing English education as the path to advancement and respectability, never recognizing that the entire system was designed to produce subordination rather than equality. Yet for all this elaborate machinery of control, the British never achieved complete dominance, never fully penetrated the depths of Indian society. The 100 administrators and their thousands of Indian subordinates governed the visible, recorded, official India, the India that appeared in census reports and revenue records, the India of courts and schools and railway stations. But beneath and around this official India thrived another India, older and more resilient, that continued to organize itself according to its own logics and priorities. Villages might send representatives to deal with the district collector, but they continued to resolve most matters internally through their traditional councils. People might register marriages and births with government officials when required, but the ceremonies that truly mattered followed religious and customary forms unchanged for centuries. Farmers might pay the land revenue demanded by the British, but they organized their actual agricultural work according to ancient patterns of cooperation and mutual obligation. Merchants kept two sets of books, one in English for the tax officials, another in their own languages recording their real transactions and networks. This hidden India was not a realm of pure resistance or untouched tradition. It was something more complex, a space of adaptation and preservation, where people took what they needed from the colonial system while maintaining their own structures of meaning and relationship. A village might adopt the British legal categories of landlord and tenant when dealing with government officials, but internally continue to recognize more complex and flexible arrangements of shared rights in land. A merchant might learn English and wear European clothes when conducting business in the city, but return to his native town to participate in festivals and customs his British clients would have found incomprehensible. A young man might study in a British-style college and work as a clerk in a government office, while his wife maintained a traditional household, worshiping at the neighborhood temple and raising their children in ways that would have been familiar to her great-grandmother. The British mistake was to interpret this adaptation as acceptance, this surface compliance as deep transformation. The census operations that the British conducted with increasing regularity and sophistication from 1871 onward perfectly illustrated this dynamic of control and evasion. The census enumerators traveled from door to door, armed with elaborate questionnaires, recording names and ages, occupations and family relationships, caste and religion and native language. They sought to render India legible, to create a comprehensive portrait of the population that could inform policy and reveal patterns. What they actually produced was a combination of misunderstanding, invention, and resistance. The concept of fixed, discrete caste categories that appeared in census forms bore little relationship to the fluid, context-dependent, regionally variable nature of actual caste practice. The census takers' insistence on classifying everyone into religious categories, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, obscured the fact that many people's actual religious practice involved elements of multiple traditions and defied these neat boundaries. The age data was often pure fabrication, since many people did not track their age in years or had reason to give false information to avoid taxation or military recruitment. The occupation categories missed the reality that most people combined multiple economic activities and shifted between them seasonally. Moreover, the act of census taking itself changed what it supposedly measured. Once the census classified castes in a hierarchy of social status, members of lower-ranked castes began organizing to challenge their classification, while higher castes defended their position. The census categories became political realities, shaping identity and conflict in new ways. When the British began collecting data on religious populations, communities suddenly had incentives to maximize their numbers in the census. Since population figures might determine representation on municipal councils or the distribution of government patronage, the census, which purported to objectively describe Indian society, actually participated in constructing new forms of Indian identity and conflict that served colonial purposes of divide and rule. And yet many Indians evaded the census entirely. Women who would not speak to male enumerators, mobile populations who were never in the same place when census takers arrived, people who simply refused to provide information or gave false answers. The comprehensive portrait of India that emerged from census reports was really a portrait of official, visible, cooperative India, a large but far from complete segment of the population. The economic impact of British administration is perhaps hardest to see because it was so pervasive, woven into the basic structure of how money flowed and resources were allocated. The most obvious mechanism was the land revenue, which typically claimed between one-third and one-half of the gross agricultural produce in British-ruled territories, a higher rate than most pre-colonial rulers had extracted. This revenue flowed into government treasuries and was used primarily to pay for the administrative and military apparatus of empire, including the substantial salaries of British officials and the pensions they drew after returning to England. The drain of wealth from India to Britain took many forms. British civil servants and military officers who saved much of their salary to remit home, British-owned businesses extracting raw materials and repatriating profits, the so-called home charges that required India to pay in London for the costs of the India office and other imperial overhead, guaranteed returns to British railway investors paid out of Indian tax revenue. Estimates vary, but by the late 19th century, India was transferring somewhere between 50 and 100 million pounds per year to Britain, wealth that might otherwise have been available for investment in irrigation, industry, education, or simply remaining in the hands of the farmers and artisans who produced it. The impact of this systematic extraction was obscured by the lack of any comparable alternative. Indians experiencing British rule in the 19th century had no way to know what their society might have looked like had that wealth remained in Indian hands, invested in Indian development. They saw the railways and telegraphs the British built and could not easily perceive that these same funds might have produced more schools, more irrigation works, more support for indigenous industries if directed by Indian priorities. The British pointed to the revenue accounts showing expenditures on public works and argued they were investing in India's development, but the accounts did not show the counterfactual, what might have been built if the structure of taxation and expenditure had been designed to benefit India rather than Britain. When Indians grew poorer over the course of the 19th century, when famines became more frequent and deadly, the British attributed this to backwardness, overpopulation, irrational agricultural practices, anything but the systematic economic exploitation that their own administrative machinery enforced. The famines deserve special attention as perhaps the clearest evidence of how British administration served British interests over Indian welfare. India had always experienced periodic droughts and harvest failures, but pre-colonial regimes had developed sophisticated systems of famine relief, reducing or suspending revenue demands in affected areas, opening royal granaries to feed the hungry, restricting exports of grain from famine zones, organizing public works to provide employment. The British swept these systems away, replacing them with a dogmatic commitment to free market principles and fiscal discipline. When famine struck, British officials insisted that government intervention would only distort market forces, that private trade would naturally move grain to areas of scarcity if left alone, that famine relief beyond minimal levels would create dependency and encourage overpopulation. The result was catastrophic. The great famines of the 1870s and 1890s killed millions, perhaps 10 million in the 1876-1878 famine alone. While grain continued to be exported from India to Britain, while government warehouses held reserve stocks that officials refused to distribute lest they disrupt market mechanisms, while starving villagers who tried to take grain without payment were prosecuted for theft. The administrative response to famine revealed the system's priorities with terrible clarity. Relief works were organized, but they required able-bodied adults to perform hard labor for wages calculated at starvation levels. The principle being that relief should be so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would seek it. Officials measured success not by lives saved, but by how little money was spent on relief per person. District collectors filed reports on famine conditions written in the same dry bureaucratic language they used to report on irrigation works or vaccination programs, noting mortality figures the way they might note fluctuations in the price of wheat. The Viceroy and his council debated famine policy with reference to political economy theory and the need to maintain fiscal soundness, spending more time worrying about the moral hazard of gratuitous relief than about the millions dying in villages their policies were killing. This was not cruelty in the ordinary sense. Few British officials actively wanted Indians to die. It was something worse: the reduction of human suffering to administrative problems, the transformation of life and death into questions of proper procedure. the inability or unwillingness to see the people in the statistics. And Indians who experience these famines, who watch their children die of hunger while government granaries remain locked, who worked until they collapsed on relief works for wages insufficient to buy enough food to live. They did not typically understand this as a failure of British administration. They lacked access to the policy debates in Calcutta and London, could not read the reports that blamed famine deaths on their own backwardness and overpopulation, did not grasp the economic theories that shaped official response. They experienced famine as a natural disaster, an act of fate or divine will, perhaps a punishment for sin or the result of inauspicious cosmic alignments. The connection between their suffering and the decisions made by the 100 British administrators remained invisible, hidden behind layers of subordinate officials and local circumstances. When a British district collector visited a famine-stricken village to inspect relief operations, he appeared as a benefactor attempting to help, not as the representative of a system that had turned a drought into a holocaust. This invisibility of power was the ultimate achievement of British administration in India. The empire had learned from earlier, cruder forms of colonialism. The Spanish in the Americas had faced constant rebellion because their exploitation was obvious. Conquistadors directly seizing gold, encomienderos visibly working indigenous people to death. The British in India developed something more sophisticated, a system of exploitation that appeared as natural economic law, as rational administration, as the inevitable workings of progress and development. When British commercial policy destroyed India's textile industry, once the world's most sophisticated, producing fabrics that had been prized from Rome to Southeast Asia for centuries, it did so not through visible force, but through the invisible operation of tariff policy and market forces. British machine-made textiles entered India duty-free, while Indian cloth faced high tariffs in British markets. Indian weavers could not compete and slowly starved, but there was no obvious villain, no colonial official ordering the destruction of their livelihood. There was only the market, that impersonal force, which British economic theory taught was always right and always served the general good. When British forest policy evicted tribal communities from their ancestral lands, declaring vast stretches of woodland to be state property reserved for scientific management and timber extraction, it did so in the language of conservation and development. The Forest Department employed experts who explained that traditional practices of shifting cultivation and common forest use were destructive and unsustainable, that modern scientific forestry was necessary to preserve forests for future generations. The fact that these preserved forests were clear-cut for their valuable timber, that tribal people who had lived in harmony with forests for millennia were branded as poachers and criminals, that traditional sustainable use was replaced by commercial exploitation that destroyed biodiversity and watershed function. All of this was obscured by the rhetoric of expertise in progress. The tribal family forcibly relocated from their forest home did not understand that their eviction was part of a broader policy designed in London to maximize the commercial value of Indian timber for sale in British markets. They knew only that men with guns had come and driven them away. The princely states that covered 2/5 of the subcontinent present an interesting counterpoint to this pattern of British administration. These were territories where Indian rulers maintained formal sovereignty, conducting their own internal administration while accepting British paramountcy in external affairs and submitting to the authority of British residents who advised, and when necessary, commanded on all important matters. The British found this system highly advantageous. It allowed them to claim they had preserved traditional Indian political structures, that they ruled with the consent and cooperation of legitimate Indian authority. It avoided the administrative burden of directly governing every territory, leaving local details to native rulers, while British residents ensured overall policy aligned with imperial interests. And it created a class of Indian princes who became deeply invested in British rule, since their own position depended on British support against both external threats and internal challenges. But the princely states also revealed how British control operated through administrative systems rather than direct rule. A resident at a princely court was typically a mid-ranking British official supported by a small staff. He could not and did not manage the day-to-day governance of a state that might contain millions of people. Yet his informal authority was nearly absolute. When the Maharaja of Indore made decisions the British disapproved, a quiet word from the resident was usually sufficient to reverse them. If quiet words failed, the British had other tools, withholding honors and ceremonial recognition that Indian rulers prized, threatening to investigate corruption and mismanagement, or in extreme cases, simply deposing the ruler and installing a more cooperative family member with British support. The genius of the resident system was that it maintained the appearance of Indian rule while ensuring British control, operating through influence and informal authority rather than direct orders that might appear as foreign domination. The Indian princes, for their part, became ornamental figures presiding over increasingly hollow thrones. They had military forces, but these were under British supervision and could not be used without British approval. They had treasuries, but British residents controlled major expenditures. They had governments, but key officials were often British appointees or Indians educated in British institutions and loyal to British interests. The more prestigious princes, the Maharajas of Mysore or Gwalior, the Nizam of Hyderabad, enjoyed considerable wealth and ceremonial dignity. But this was dignity granted by British favor, revocable if they challenged British authority. And their subjects, who might feel loyalty to their traditional rulers, could not easily see that these rulers had become puppets, that the real decisions affecting their lives came from British officials, that their prince's role was increasingly reduced to providing local legitimacy to British policy. As the 19th century wore on, a new educated class of Indians began to perceive the mechanisms of their own subordination. These were men who had benefited from British education, who had learned to read English and access British political theory, who studied the history of how other nations had thrown off colonial rule. They founded newspapers and voluntary associations, petitioned for greater Indian representation in government, eventually formed political organizations like the Indian National Congress. But even their resistance was shaped by the administrative systems they challenged. They submitted petitions rather than organizing armed rebellion, argued in terms of British constitutional principles rather than rejecting British rule entirely, sought reforms within the system rather than its overthrow. This was partly tactical. The full force of British military power crushed direct resistance, as the events of 1857 had demonstrated. But it was also a measure of how thoroughly the administrative colonization of India had succeeded in colonizing minds as well. The early nationalist leaders were, almost without exception, men who worked within the British system, lawyers who practiced in British courts, journalists who wrote in English, teachers employed in government schools, merchants whose businesses depended on the British commercial framework. They wanted India to govern itself, but they largely accepted British definitions of what constituted legitimate governance. They critiqued British policies for violating the principles of liberty and democracy that Britain claimed to uphold, but they rarely questioned whether those principles themselves were appropriate for India. They sought to prove Indians capable of self-government by British standards, accepting implicitly that British standards were the measure of civilization. The trap was nearly perfect. To effectively challenge British rule required mastering the English language and British political discourse, but mastering these tools often meant adopting the assumptions and worldview embedded in them. Yet even among the educated nationalists, in the villages and towns where most Indians lived, different forms of resistance persisted. These were rarely frontal challenges to British authority, which would have been swiftly crushed. Instead, they took the form of what scholars now call everyday resistance: foot-dragging and evasion, minor sabotage and theft, manipulating the system to serve local purposes, maintaining alternative structures of authority and meaning beneath the surface of colonial administration. A village might comply with British revenue demands just enough to avoid punishment while using various tactics to minimize what they actually paid. Farmers might misreport their actual harvest, hide land from settlement surveys, claim land was less productive than it really was. When British forestry officials declared trees to be government property, villagers continued to cut them anyway, timing their gathering for periods when enforcement was lax, bribing the low-level guards, who were the actual enforcers of forest law. When British schools were established, villages might send a few children to satisfy the officials while continuing their own informal education through traditional means. This pattern of surface compliance masking deeper resistance meant that British administrators often drastically overestimated their actual control. A district collector filing his annual report might detail the progress of revenue collection, the decline in court cases, the attendance figures at government schools, and conclude that his district was well administered and content. He could not see the resentment simmering beneath that surface order, the ways his policies were being evaded or subverted, the continuing vitality of social organization that operated entirely outside his awareness. When rebellion came, as it periodically did in various regions throughout the period of British rule, British officials were consistently shocked and baffled, unable to understand how people they believed to be content could suddenly rise in violent resistance. The incomprehension was mutual. British administrators could not see why Indians resented policies that seemed rational and progressive to British eyes, while Indians could not understand why the British seemed so determined to destroy their way of life in the name of improvement. The military force that ultimately underlay all British administration was itself largely Indian. By the late 19th century, the Indian Army numbered nearly 200,000 men, of whom only about 70,000 were British. The rest were Indian soldiers, Sikhs and Gurkhas, Pathans and Marathas, recruited from groups the British classified as martial races and set against their own countrymen when rebellion threatened. This Indian military force allowed the British to maintain control with relatively few British troops, saving enormous expense and solving the logistical problems of stationing large European armies in India's climate. But it also created a profound contradiction. The empire was maintained by Indian soldiers who could have overthrown it at any moment if they chose to act collectively against their British officers. The shadow of 1857, when much of the Bengal army had mutinied and come terrifyingly close to driving the British from India, haunted British military planning for decades afterward. The response was a sophisticated system of divide and rule. Regiments were composed of men from different ethnic and religious backgrounds who might have little loyalty to each other. Units were regularly rotated between stations to prevent them from developing strong ties to local populations. British officers were trained to emphasize the honor and prestige of military service, the special privileges soldiers enjoyed, the notion that the army stood above and apart from the civilian society. Soldiers were paid well by Indian standards and granted pensions after service, creating a class with material interest in the continuation of British rule. And the army itself became a tool of ethnic policy, with British officials promoting the notion that certain groups were inherently martial while others were cowardly or effeminate. The designation of martial race carried both privilege and insult. It granted access to military employment and its benefits. But it also implied that these groups were naturally suited to serve as soldiers, that is, to follow orders and fight on behalf of others, rather than for self-governance and independent leadership. The British officials who staffed the administrative system, who made the day-to-day decisions that governed 400 million lives, were young men from the British middle and upper middle classes seeking careers and adventure. They came to India not out of hatred for Indians or explicit desire to exploit, but simply because the Indian civil service offered excellent pay, considerable prestige, and opportunities for power and responsibility they could never have achieved at home. A young man who might have been a minor country solicitor in England could be a district collector in India, wielding more authority than many British aristocrats, served by an army of subordinates. Treated with deference by Indian princes and wealthy merchants, the temptations were obvious. What is perhaps more remarkable is that many of these young officials, despite their privileged position, developed genuine affection for India and concern for its people. They learned Indian languages fluently, studied Indian history and culture, worked long hours in difficult conditions, trying to improve irrigation or education or public health in their districts. Yet this personal decency coexisted with systematic oppression because the system itself was oppressive, regardless of the individual character of those who staffed it. A district collector might work tirelessly to bring famine relief to his district, and within the constraints of British policy, he might save many lives. But he operated within a system that had made the famine worse through its economic policies, that restricted how much relief he could provide, that valued administrative tidiness and fiscal discipline over human life. His personal kindness and hard work made him feel virtuous, confirmed his belief that British rule was ultimately benevolent. Yet the cumulative effect of thousands of such officials making individually reasonable decisions within a fundamentally exploitative framework was impoverishment and suffering on a massive scale. The tragedy of British administration was not that it was staffed by monsters, though there were certainly brutal and racist officials, but that it was staffed by ordinary people who convinced themselves they were doing good while serving a system designed for extraction and control. The monuments the British left across India tell this story in stone and steel. The grand railway stations, the imposing government buildings, the cantonment areas with their orderly bungalows and parade grounds, these were designed to impress and overawe, to demonstrate British power and permanence, to make British rule seem natural and inevitable. The Victoria Terminus in Bombay, now Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus, stands as perhaps the supreme example. A Gothic cathedral to the railway, blending Victorian Gothic revival with Indian decorative elements in a style the British called Indo-Saracenic. It was magnificent, certainly, but magnificence in service of what? The railway it housed existed primarily to move cotton from the interior to Bombay for export to British textile mills, to move British manufactured goods inland for sale in Indian markets, to transport troops to wherever rebellion might threaten. Its beauty was the beauty of power, designed to make Indians forget to ask whose interests it actually served. Contrast this with the monuments that Indians themselves built when they could: temples and mosques, stepwells and tanks, market buildings and residential neighborhoods. These were designed for human use in community life, their beauty emerging from function and tradition rather than imposed as a display of dominance. The British pattern of urban planning created sharp spatial segregation. Civil lines where British officials lived in spacious isolation, native quarters where Indians crowded in narrow lanes, commercial districts dominated by British and Parsi firms, industrial areas where Indian workers labored in factories owned by British capital. This physical segregation mirrored and reinforced the administrative segregation that kept Indians and British in separate worlds, even as they occupied the same territory. A British official could live in India for decades and never enter an Indian home, never eat Indian food, never participate in an Indian religious festival, except as a tourist or official observer. His knowledge of India was entirely mediated through reports and official interactions, a purely administrative India that bore little relationship to how most Indians actually lived. The turning point, though it was not recognized at the time, came gradually through the late 19th and early 20th centuries as the administrative system began to undermine itself. By creating a class of educated Indians, the British had created people capable of reading their own history, understanding the mechanisms of their exploitation, imagining alternatives. By building railways and telegraphs, they had connected India in new ways, allowing regional grievances to become national movements, allowing leaders to emerge who could speak to millions. By establishing courts and a legal framework, they had given Indians tools to challenge British actions, to expose the gap between British rhetoric about justice and British practice. By creating the census and statistical surveys, they had made Indians conscious of themselves as a nation, a population with common interests distinct from British interests. The administrative machinery designed for control became the means of resistance. Yet even as nationalist consciousness grew, even as the Indian National Congress began demanding self-governance, the day-to-day administration continued largely unchanged. The same district collectors made their tours, the same revenue officials assessed taxes, the same courts heard cases. Most Indians' direct experience of government remained through these local interactions, and for them, the high politics of nationalism and empire remained distant. The promise of eventual self-rule seemed abstract compared to immediate concerns about the harvest, about debt to moneylenders, about whether their son could get a place in the government school. This was perhaps the final achievement of British administrative control. It had made itself seem permanent, had so thoroughly embedded itself in the structures of daily life that imagining its absence became difficult even for those who opposed it. The First World War began to crack this illusion. India contributed massive resources to the British war effort. More than 1 million soldiers, countless laborers, money and materials that drained an already impoverished economy. In return, Indians were promised greater self-governance, a reward for their loyalty and sacrifice. When the war ended and these promises were betrayed, when the Rowlatt Acts extended wartime repression and the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919 saw British troops fire into an unarmed crowd, killing hundreds, the legitimacy of British rule suffered a blow from which it never recovered. But even then, the administrative system persisted. The same officials went to the same offices, the same procedures governed the same processes. What changed was that fewer Indians accepted the system's legitimacy, more were willing to challenge it, and the 100 British administrators found themselves governing not through acceptance and participation, but through naked force thinly disguised by bureaucratic procedure. The story of British administration in India is not primarily a story of battles and dramatic events, though these occurred. It is a story of paperwork and precedent, of decisions made in distant offices by men who never saw the effects of those decisions, of systems designed to make exploitation appear as rational policy. It is the story of how a tiny number of foreign officials managed to rule a subcontinent through the careful construction of administrative machinery that made their power seem natural and inevitable, that co-opted local elites and created structures of interest binding Indians to British rule, that transformed living social reality into statistical data and legal categories that could be manipulated by those who controlled the administrative apparatus. But it is also a story of resistance and resilience, of how Indians navigated and subverted these systems, maintained their own structures of meaning and authority beneath the surface of colonial control, adapted foreign tools to local purposes. The British ruled India for nearly 2 centuries, but they never controlled it completely, never penetrated to the depths of society where life continued to organize itself according to older patterns and different logics. The 100 administrators and their Indian subordinates governed the visible, official, recorded India. The living India remained always partly beyond their grasp, continuing to exist in ways they could not fully see or understand, waiting for the moment when the administrative machinery would finally be dismantled and Indians could determine their own future. The final irony is that when that moment came, when India finally achieved independence in 1947, the administrative machinery largely continued unchanged. The same laws remained in force, the same bureaucratic procedures governed the same processes, the same offices functioned under new management. The Indian Civil Service became the Indian Administrative Service, still recruited through competitive examinations, still operating according to inherited procedures, still structuring itself in the same hierarchical patterns. The British had not simply exploited India, they had fundamentally restructured how India was governed, had created administrative systems that outlived the empire itself. The legacy of those 100 administrators extends to the present day, embedded in institutions and practices that continue to shape life in the subcontinent more than 70 years after British rule ended. Delhi today, with its traffic and technology, its massive bureaucratic apparatus in the same buildings the British built, its civil servants still filling out forms according to procedures developed to serve colonial extraction, all of it testifies to how deeply administrative colonialism penetrated, how difficult it is to escape systems that have become part of reality itself. The visible signs of British rule, the statues, the place names, these have been removed or renamed, but the invisible structures, the administrative logic, the ways of organizing governance and society that the British imposed, these remain, still shaping how power flows and how lives are governed. The 100 administrators are long gone, but their shadow stretches across more than a century, a reminder that the most effective form of control is not the sword, but the system, not force, but framework, not violence, but the transformation of violence into procedures so normalized that it becomes invisible. The lesson, if there is one, is about the nature of power itself. The British Empire in India was maintained not primarily through superior force or technology, though these helped, but through the creation of administrative systems that made British rule seem natural and necessary, that made alternatives unthinkable, that co-opted potential resistors and made millions of Indians participants in their own subordination. It succeeded for as long as it did because it hid its exploitation behind the language of development and progress, because it fragmented resistance by operating through layers of intermediaries, because it made the connections between policy and suffering deliberately obscure. And it failed ultimately not because Indians lacked the power to resist, they had always had that power in sheer numbers, but because Indians gradually developed the consciousness and organization to see through the system, to understand the mechanisms of their exploitation, to imagine and demand an alternative. The machinery of empire was not broken by force, but by the withdrawal of consent, by millions of Indians deciding simultaneously that British rule was no longer legitimate, that the systems could no longer function without their cooperation. The administrative machinery had always depended on Indian participation, and when that participation was withheld or turned to resistance, the 100 British administrators discovered that all their files and procedures and regulations were powerless. In the end, the lesson of British rule in India is both the power of administrative systems to control populations far larger than the administrators themselves, and the ultimate fragility of such systems when the governed refuse to be governed, when the legitimacy on which administration depends dissolves, when people choose to see through the illusions that power constructs to make itself invisible. 400 million lives controlled by 100 men? It should never have been possible, and in the deepest sense, it never was. What the British controlled was not India itself, but a representation of India, a map they had drawn and convinced many Indians to live within. But the territory was always larger than the map, the reality more complex than the administrative categories designed to simplify it. The story of British administration in India is ultimately a story about the limits of control, about how power overreaches and collapses, about how human beings persist in their own truth even under the weight of empires, about how history moves toward freedom not in dramatic revolutionary moments, but through the slow accumulation of small acts of resistance, through the preservation of memory and dignity, through the refusal to accept that what exists must be eternal. The 100 administrators are footnotes now, their reports gathering dust in archives, their certainties revealed as illusions. India remains vast and various, shaped but not defined by the systems that once claimed to rule it, carrying forward into the future the accumulated weight of all its past, empire included but not determinative.